There are approximately 34,000 statues of Kim Il-sung in North Korea. One for every village. One for every school. One for every government building, every train station, every public square in a country of 26 million people. Citizens are required to bow to them. Visitors are required to bow to them. The flowers placed at their bases are counted. The angle of the bow is monitored. Kim Il-sung died in 1994. He has been the official head of state of North Korea ever since. Not symbolically. Officially. Legally. The Constitution of North Korea designates him eternal president, a title held by no living person because the person who holds it is dead, and has been for 30 years, and the country he built has decided that death is not sufficient reason to stop being president. This is not an accident of governance. It is the logical endpoint of a system that Kim Il-sung spent 50 years constructing, a system designed not simply to control people but to own them. Their thoughts. Their loyalty. Their understanding of reality itself. What he built in North Korea is the most complete dictatorship in recorded human history. This is how he built it. Kim Il-sung was born Kim Song-ju on April 15, 1912, in a village near Pyongyang. He was not born a god. He was not born into power. He was born into a Korea under Japanese colonial rule, the same colonial system that this channel covered in episode 19, into a family of modest means that would relocate to Manchuria when he was a child, following the pattern of Korean migration that poverty and colonial pressure produced across the peninsula in the early 20th century. He became a guerrilla fighter. In the 1930s, Kim, who had adopted the name of a legendary Korean independence fighter, Kim Il-sung, as a nom de guerre, fought as a commander in the anti-Japanese resistance in Manchuria. His exploits during this period were real enough to generate a reputation, though the specific details were subsequently embellished to a degree that the historical record can no longer fully disentangle from the mythology that replaced it. By the early 1940s, Japanese military pressure had forced him and his unit across the border into the Soviet Union. He spent the war years in Soviet Siberia, where he received military training, married, and had his first son, Kim Jong-il, born in 1941, who would eventually inherit the state his father built. When Soviet forces occupied the northern half of Korea following Japan's surrender in 1945, they needed a Korean leader for the government they were establishing. They chose Kim Il-sung. He was 33 years old. He had a genuine resistance record and Soviet sponsorship. He had limited political experience and a name that was already known. He was, from the Soviet perspective, manageable. He was not manageable. Within a decade, he had consolidated power in ways that surprised even the Soviet advisors who had installed him, purging rivals, eliminating alternative power centers, and building a system of personal rule that would eventually make him independent of the Soviet Union that had created him. The Kim Il-sung that North Koreans encountered was not the Kim Il-sung that history records. The regime's version of Kim Il-sung was built systematically across the late 1940s and 1950s, a mythology constructed by the propaganda apparatus of the Korean Workers' Party that transformed a Soviet-installed guerrilla commander into something closer to a divine figure. His birthplace was reimagined as a site of sacred significance. His guerrilla exploits were expanded into feats of near-supernatural heroism. His personal history was rewritten to remove the Soviet period, the years in Siberia, the Soviet sponsorship, the fact that his rise to power had depended on foreign military occupation, and replace it with an unbroken narrative of Korean nationalist struggle that owed nothing to anyone. The most significant mythological construction was the Sacred Mountain. Paektu Mountain, a volcanic peak on the border between North Korea and China, considered sacred in Korean culture, became the official birthplace of Kim Jong-il in the North Korean narrative. Kim Jong-il was actually born in the Soviet Union in 1941. The regime moved his birthplace to Paektu Mountain, assigned it the year 1942, and built an entire sacred geography around the claim, shrines, pilgrimage routes, the specific landscape of a mountain that became the origin point of the dynasty's divine legitimacy. The falsification was not subtle. It was comprehensive. And it worked, because in a state that controls all information, a lie told consistently enough becomes the only truth available. If this history is new to you, subscribe to Unsolved East and hit like. New episodes every week. Kim Il-sung did not simply seize power in North Korea. He engineered a system. The distinction matters. Dictators who seize power depend on the ongoing willingness of their security forces to maintain them. They are vulnerable to coups, to defection, to the shifting loyalties of the people who hold the guns. Kim Il-sung built something more durable, a system in which the population's loyalty was not maintained by force alone but by the systematic control of every alternative framework through which reality could be understood. The first pillar was ideology. Juche, usually translated as self-reliance, was the official ideology that Kim Il-sung developed and codified across the 1950s and 1960s. In its formal philosophical content, Juche emphasized Korean national autonomy and the centrality of human will in shaping historical outcomes. In its practical political application, it meant something simpler and more totalizing. Korea needed nothing from the outside world had nothing to offer Korea, and the supreme expression of Korean self-reliance was the absolute loyalty of every Korean to the leader who embodied it. Juche made Kim Il-sung not just politically necessary but philosophically necessary. To question him was not to question a policy. It was to contradict the foundational principle of Korean existence. The second pillar was the Songbun system. As this channel covered in episode 22, Songbun assigned every North Korean citizen a hereditary political classification based on their family's perceived loyalty to the regime. The classification determined every meaningful aspect of life: where you lived, where you went to school, what jobs you could hold, whether you ate or went hungry during periods of shortage. Songbun created a population that was materially invested in the system's perpetuation. The core class, those with the highest Songbun, had genuine privilege to protect. The hostile class, those with the lowest, had a constant incentive to demonstrate loyalty as the only possible path toward improving their circumstances. The third pillar was information control. North Korea was, from its founding, a state that managed information as its primary resource. Radio receivers were manufactured to receive only state frequencies. Radios already in existence were modified, required to be surrendered for modification, with the penalty for possession of an unmodified receiver being severe. Publications from outside the country were not available. Later, as global media expanded, the specific effort required to prevent North Koreans from accessing outside information scaled with the technology, but the principle remained constant. A population that cannot access alternative information cannot form alternative beliefs. A population that cannot form alternative beliefs cannot organize alternative loyalties. A population without alternative loyalties is the most stable foundation for absolute power that has ever been constructed. What made Kim Il-sung's system different from other dictatorships was not the brutality, though the brutality was real and extensive. It was the aspiration to make the brutality unnecessary. The political prison camps existed. The purges existed. The public executions existed. These were the instruments of control for the people who could not be reached by the ideology, the people who saw through it, or who encountered it at its limits, or who simply needed something it could not provide. But the aspiration of the Kimist system was a population that did not need to be coerced because it genuinely believed. A population that reported its neighbors not because it feared punishment for failing to but because it understood, in its bones, that this was the right thing to do. A population so thoroughly shaped by the ideological environment it had been born into that the question of whether to be loyal to the leader never arose, because the loyalty was not a choice but a condition of existence. How close North Korea came to achieving that aspiration is one of the most debated questions in the academic literature on totalitarianism. The answer, based on defector testimony, is closer than anyone outside the system would find comfortable to acknowledge. The Korean War transformed Kim Il-sung's North Korea. The war that began in June 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, ended in July 1953 with an armistice that left the peninsula divided roughly where it had started, after 3 years of fighting that killed an estimated 3 to 4 million Koreans on both sides and involved the forces of 17 countries. For North Korea, the war was catastrophic. American bombing campaigns, authorized under UN command and far more extensive than is generally acknowledged in Western historical memory, destroyed an estimated 75 to 80% of North Korea's buildings and infrastructure. Pyongyang was bombed repeatedly until, By some accounts, there were no more significant targets left standing. The U.S. Air Force dropped more bombs on North Korea during the Korean War than it had dropped in the entire Pacific Theater during World War II. This is not a justification for what Kim Il-sung built on the ruins. It is the context without which the building cannot be understood. A population that has experienced total destruction, whose cities have been leveled, whose infrastructure has been obliterated, whose experience of the outside world is overwhelmingly one of violence from beyond the border, is a population that is psychologically primed for the kind of total state that Kim Il-sung offered. The external threat was real. The need for protection was real. The leader who promised both was positioning himself within a genuine national trauma, not a manufactured one. Kim Il-sung rebuilt North Korea from the rubble of the war with Soviet and Chinese assistance. The reconstruction was genuine. The cities rose. The infrastructure was restored. The economy, in the 1950s and 1960s, performed better than South Korea's, a fact that is rarely acknowledged in Western narratives of the two Koreas, but that is documented in the economic data of the period. The reconstruction gave the cult of personality its most durable foundation. Kim Il-sung had not just built a state. He had rebuilt a nation that had been reduced to ash. The gratitude that this produced in a population that had experienced the alternative, that had lived through the bombing, was the most authentic raw material the system had available. It did not need to be entirely manufactured. It needed to be shaped, sustained, and institutionalized. That is what the ideology, the Songbun, and the information control were for. In 1980, Kim Il-sung made a decision that transformed North Korea from a dictatorship into a dynasty. He designated his son, Kim Jong-il, as his successor. The decision was not constitutionally provided for. No democratic system would have permitted it. No other communist state had attempted hereditary succession at this scale. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, the other major communist states, all had collective leadership mechanisms, however imperfect, that prevented the direct inheritance of supreme power by a family member. North Korea had none. The designation of Kim Jong-il, accomplished through the gradual elevation of the younger Kim through the party hierarchy across the 1970s, was the moment that the system Kim Il-sung had built revealed its ultimate logic. A system built around the indispensability of a single person faces an existential problem when that person dies. The solution Kim Il-sung chose was to make the indispensability heritable. The son was not just the successor. The son was, in the mythology that the regime constructed, the natural continuation of the sacred bloodline, the dynasty of peak to mountain, the eternal family of the Korean nation. Kim Il-sung died on July 8, 1994. Kim Jong-il assumed power. The system did not miss a beat. Kim Il-sung has been the eternal president of North Korea for 30 years. The title was conferred posthumously, written into the constitution after his death in 1994 to ensure that the system he had built would not require a new ideological foundation. He was not replaced. He was elevated, from living leader to permanent divine presence, from president to eternal president, from the man who had built the system to the sacred origin point around which the system permanently orbited. His son ruled for 17 years after his death. His grandson has ruled for 12 years since. The dynasty that he created in 1980, when he designated Kim Jong-il as successor, has governed North Korea for 45 years, longer than the Soviet Union lasted, longer than most empires of the 20th century. The 34,000 statues are still there. The bowing is still required. The flowers are still counted. Here is the question that Kim Il-sung's life and system leaves open, the one that historians and political scientists have debated for decades without resolution. Is what he built sustainable? Every totalitarian system in history has eventually ended. The Soviet Union ended. Nazi Germany ended. The Khmer Rouge ended. The mechanisms of total control that seemed permanent proved, in each case, to have limits imposed by the fundamental human resistance to complete domination, by the economic inefficiencies of systems that prioritize loyalty over competence, by the specific fragility of systems that depend entirely on the continuation of a single bloodline. North Korea has outlasted every prediction of its imminent collapse. It has done so for 30 years since Kim Il-sung's death. The system he built is still running. 26 million people are still inside it. The question of whether it will end, and what the ending will look like when it comes, is the most consequential unanswered question in Asia today.